Hey everyone! Tonight, we're diving into the strange, forgotten side of history. Not kings and conquests, but vitamins, miracle tonics, and the deadly lies people swallowed in the name of health. Because what you're about to hear isn't in textbooks. It's not the clean version written by victors. It's the bitter, powdered truth. How empires fell chasing eternal youth, divine energy, and magical cures sold in clay jars and golden bowls. So if you came expecting balanced diets and wise old doctors, brace yourself. This story is laced with bone dust, blood tonics, ginseng fakes, and chocolate brews that promised life and delivered collapse. We're not just unsealing history, we're uncorking the scams that ruin civilizations, one spoonful at a time. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love the story. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Tomorrow, come back and tell me which part of the story you fell asleep during. I'd really love to know. Now lower your lights. Maybe let a soft fan hum in the background and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1. The bitter citrus lie, scurvy in the age of exploration. It began with the swell of waves beneath oak hulls and the flutter of canvas catching the wind. The 16th century was drunk on dreams of conquest and gold. Ships left Lisbon, Seville, and London with hulls packed tight. Casks of salt meat, barrels of biscuits, the glint of polished muskets, and chests of maps inked with imagination more than knowledge. But hidden among the ropes and shadows was a quiet, insidious threat. A killer so old, so devastating, and yet so poorly understood that it consumed lives by the thousands without ever raising a blade. They called it the Sea Plague. Sailors feared it, captains cursed it, and apothecaries peddled cures as elusive as the far-off Indies they all sought. Today we know it simply as scurvy. For the sailor braving the unknown, death came not with a cannonball or cutlass, but through slow decay. It began with fatigue. Muscles once used to scaling masts or hauling sails weakened. Gums softened, teeth loosened, old wounds reopened without cause. Legs swelled until they could barely walk. The afflicted cried out not in pain, but in confusion. How could a man who stood strong at Gibraltar be reduced to a groaning heap off the coast of Brazil? To the men who sailed under the banners of empire, scurvy was more than an illness. It was betrayal. Something invisible crawling beneath their skin, killing them from within. And yet the real betrayal came not from the ocean, but from the land they left behind. The merchants, monarchs, and medical men who claimed to understand the human body sold them lies in glass bottles and wax-sealed vials. They promised cures, but what they delivered was a fatal illusion. At the heart of this deception was a simple truth lost to ignorance. The human body needs vitamin C. Today, that fact feels obvious. We know oranges prevent scurvy. We toss lemon slices into our water without a second thought. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, the science didn't exist. And without that knowledge, entire empires faltered on the backs of starved, bleeding men. James Lancaster's 1601 voyage is often remembered for its violence and spoils, but few recall the human toll it extracted. Of the 4 ships he commanded under the East India Company, hundreds of men fell ill to scurvy before they ever saw the spice ports of India. By the time they reached their destination, The ships were so short of able-bodied crew that Lancaster had to order men chained upright to cannons just to keep them from collapsing in front of local rulers. He had been advised to bring along vinegar and oils infused with herbs, not citrus. Not once was lemon juice mentioned in his orders from England. The voyage succeeded in commerce, but at a ghastly price. And then there were the Spanish, the most powerful maritime force of the early modern era. They too were plagued by the sea plague. Their doctors recommended wine mixed with garlic, seawater rinses, and even bloodletting. When these treatments failed, as they always did, the dead were wrapped in their own hammocks and dropped overboard by the dozen. On long Pacific crossings, entire decks turned into makeshift hospitals, filled with the reek of rotting gums and the groans of men too weak to stand. Captains, desperate to retain order, often resorted to flogging the sick, believing their ailments were laziness in disguise. The tragedy, of course, is that the cure had been known for centuries, if only in pieces. Indigenous sailors in parts of the Pacific had long chewed on citrus-like fruits during long sea voyages. Arab traders who moved between coastal ports of Africa and India sometimes carried limes or lemons in their water stores. Even the Portuguese, during their early exploration of Africa, noticed that citrus fruits seemed to have a rejuvenating effect. But these observations never crystallized into policy. They never became doctrine. Why? The answer lies in pride and power. Medical orthodoxy in Europe was deeply rooted in Galenic theory, an ancient system that believed disease came from imbalances in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, it wasn't because of a missing vitamin. It was because your body was too cold or too wet or your liver had betrayed you. Citrus fruits didn't fit into this system. They couldn't be categorized properly. They were refreshing, yes, pleasant, sure, but medicine? Unlikely. And so the charlatans took the stage. Vendors and physicians sold concoctions made from vinegar, which they claimed opened the blood. Others swore by dried herbs ground into powder and stuffed into capsules. Some shipped barrels of oil infused with rosemary and sage to be rubbed on the chest at sunrise. None of it worked, but desperate crews kept buying. Admirals kept funding, and sailors kept dying. In 1740, Commodore George Anson of the British Navy set sail on a voyage meant to disrupt Spanish holdings in the Pacific. He departed with nearly 2,000 men. By the time he limped back to England 4 years later, over 1,400 of them were dead, most not from enemy fire but from scurvy. His ships, though packed with gunpowder and ambition, were fatally short on citrus. Anson later described watching his crew disintegrate before his eyes. Men who could no longer eat, drink, or even speak. The decks were silent, save for the wind and the occasional prayer. Still, the medical establishment resisted the truth. When reports surfaced that sailors who ate citrus seemed to fare better, scholars scoffed. They pointed to inconsistent results or accused the sailors of exaggeration. Worse, citrus fruits were expensive, and their transport complicated. They spoiled quickly, and storing them on long voyages seemed wasteful to accountants back home. It was easier to keep using the old methods to pretend they worked than to reconfigure entire naval provisioning systems. Yet a few voices, quiet at first, began to rise above the noise. In the mid-18th century, a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind conducted one of the earliest controlled medical experiments aboard the HMS Salisbury. Faced with a scurvy outbreak, He divided 12 afflicted sailors into 6 pairs, each given a different treatment. One pair was given cider, another vinegar, others received seawater or spicy paste, but one lucky pair was fed 2 oranges and a lemon daily. Within days they were back on their feet. The others remained near death. Lynn's findings were revolutionary, but they were buried in footnotes. His own publication diluted the message, wrapped it in dense prose and humility. He did not shout his discovery from the rooftops. The Admiralty noticed, but it would take nearly 50 years before the British Navy finally implemented citrus juice rations. And even then, the victory was partial. Limes were cheaper than lemons, but contained less vitamin C. The limey solution was better than nothing, but not perfect. Still, it saved countless lives, enough that British ships began to dominate the seas more consistently. The delay, however, had already done its damage. Countless expeditions that might have succeeded failed due to crew attrition. Entire colonial plans had been set back years. Forts were never built. Alliances were never forged. Whole chapters of imperial history had been rewritten by a preventable deficiency. The dead had paid the price for the stubbornness of their leaders. The irony of scurvy is not just its horror, it's the simplicity of its prevention. A single lemon a day could have saved tens of thousands of lives. But pride, ignorance, and the profiteering of health fads turned a solvable problem into a death sentence. The sea plague wasn't inevitable. It was manufactured through myth. In the quiet spaces between battles, empires were undone not by their enemies, but by their own refusal to trust the evidence of lived experience. Scurvy is a reminder that even the greatest fleets can rot from within when truth is ignored. For the men who bled from their gums and cried out in the night, it wasn't enough to be brave. They had been told a lie, sold a myth, and they died for it. And so the ships came home, if they came home at all, with decks scrubbed clean and journals filled with silence. Somewhere in a dockside tavern, a retired sailor would lift a glass of bitter wine and say nothing about the real killer he had faced. For who would believe that it wasn't pirates or storms, but the absence of a fruit that nearly brought empires to their knees? Because history, as it turns out, isn't always written in blood or gold, but in the quiet scorn of a lemon left behind. Chapter 2: Roman Bone Dust and the Calcium Crisis. The air in ancient Rome smelled of marble dust, baked bread, olive oil, and perfume. The city, at its height, was a tapestry of sensory delights, fountains burbling in courtyards, silks rustling in crowded markets, gold flashing in the sunlight off the togas of patricians. It was a city of excess, of indulgence, of people who believed they had conquered not just the known world, but time itself. The wealthy lived in pursuit of eternity, if not for their bodies, then at least for their names. Their homes were carved into history with mosaics and monuments, but their bodies were a different matter. Flesh faded, bones broke, and time spared no one, no matter how many slaves carried their litters or how many statues bore their likeness. And so, like all civilizations that teeter on the edge of luxury and madness, the Romans began to turn inward. They looked not just to architecture or conquest for legacy, but to health, specifically to what they believed would preserve strength, beauty, and virility. In a city where aging was considered undignified, and where a crumbling body was seen as a moral failing, the rich began to chase a miracle that would hold their bones together and keep their faces smooth. It began quietly, a whisper in the bathhouses, a knowing nod from one matron to another. Bone dust, they said. That's what the Greeks used. Crushed from oxen, ground fine as flour. A spoonful in wine each morning could keep the limbs supple and the spine straight. At first it was a curiosity, something for the eccentric or the devout. But as with all health fads that promise the impossible, it caught fire. Soon, in the shadowed corners of the Forum and the smoky stalls of the Subura, bone powder became currency. Mixed with oyster shell, coral, and chalk, these early supplements promised more than just strong bones. They offered vitality, virility, fertility, immortality in a cup. Of course, it wasn't just bones. There were brews made from powdered deer antlers, lion's teeth, and even the calcined skulls of executed criminals, thought to contain the power of stolen life. These were blended with rare herbs from the east and minerals scraped from volcanic springs. Apothecaries sold them in wax-sealed jars, gilded with Latin labels and hawked with dramatic flair. Strength from the gods, youth eternal, a future without fractures. The main customers were not gladiators or soldiers, but aristocratic women. Roman matrons were expected to bear many children and remain attractive while doing so. Their wealth allowed them access to the best physicians, but even those learned men of Rome still clung to Galenic ideas and spiritual humors. They advised bone dust for brittle nails, chalk water for weak wombs, and crushed shell drinks to harden the body against decay. These women, whose social value was tied to fertility and poise, became the earliest and most loyal customers of these early calcium tonics. But something went wrong. Something was already wrong. Rome had another ingredient in its daily life. One it did not advertise, but one which ran through every pipe, filled every jug, and touched every lip. Lead. The Roman aqueducts were marvels of engineering. Water flowed into the city in streams so clean they glistened like glass. But between the source and the mouth, the water passed through lead pipes, cheap, soft, and easy to mold. And lead did more than just carry water. It was used to sweeten wine in the form of sapa, a boiled-down syrup that balanced the bitterness of grapes past their prime. It lined cooking pots, sealed containers, and was added to cosmetics. It was everywhere, and it was poisoning the very people who drank their bone dust with pride. When calcium enters the body, it needs to be absorbed through the gut and distributed properly to strengthen bones and teeth. But when lead is present, the body gets confused, treats lead like calcium. It draws it in and deposits it into the bones, the blood, the brain. Over time, this causes neurological decline, muscular weakness, reproductive failure, and brittle bones, the very problems the supplements were supposed to fix. So the Roman elite, in their endless pursuit of health, were swallowing bone powder to stay young, while lead seeped into their marrow. They were drinking chalk and shell to ensure strong sons, while their wombs slowly calcified with a heavy metal they didn't even know existed. Women miscarried. Children were born weak or not born at all. Men became infertile, impotent, and slow of thought. But because the process was gradual and cloaked in ritual, no one noticed the pattern. They blamed spirits, bad omens, the stars. And so the fad grew. By the time of Emperor Augustus, the use of mineral supplements had become so widespread among the upper class that entire markets were devoted to it. There were stalls that sold nothing but bone dust from different animals, each with its own supposed benefit. Camel for endurance, cow for calm, wolf for aggression, Wealthy families sent slaves into the countryside to collect shells and bones, which were ground in massive stone mills and packed into clay jars with little scrolls advising daily doses. Physicians gave lectures on which mixtures were best for each season. Aulus Celsus, one of Rome's most famous medical authors, even included oyster shell and burnt bone ash in his encyclopedic treatise De Medicina, promoting their use for broken bones and tooth pain. What none of them understood was that the lead in their wine and water was acting like a thief in the night, replacing their real calcium with poison. When bones broke, and they broke often, the healing took longer. When children failed to grow properly, it was chalked up to divine judgment. When women became barren after a few pregnancies, it was fate. The elite bloodlines of Rome, those storied names like Claudius, Julia, and Flavia, began to thin. Infertility ran through families like a quiet curse. Marriages that once produced 10 or 12 children now yielded 1 or 2, often sickly. Adoption became common, not just as a political tool but as a necessity. The emperors themselves suffered. Claudius walked with a limp and stuttered. Nero was known for his erratic behavior. Caligula descended into madness. While some of this can be blamed on power, politics, or inbreeding, modern scholars believe lead played a significant role. The Romans were not just killing themselves with decadence, but with deception disguised as medicine. And still they drank. Still they mixed bone powder into honeyed wine. Still they believed. Meanwhile, in the streets, the poor drank water from public fountains lined with the same lead. But they could not afford bone dust or fancy supplements. They ate simply barley, olives, cabbage, bread. They did not sweeten their wine with sapa. They did not store their water in lead-glazed jugs. And so, ironically, it was often the poor who suffered fewer symptoms of lead poisoning. Their children were stronger. Their bones healed faster. They were, in the end, more robust than the people who ruled them. The collapse of Rome is a story with many authors: barbarian invasions, economic instability, overexpansion. But beneath the banners and battles was a quieter story, written in the blood and bone of the people themselves. The upper class, believing themselves immune to the decay of time, were being hollowed out from within. Their obsession with strength made them weaker. Their pursuit of health made them sick. And the supplements they trusted were part of the very system that ensured their decline. By the time the Western Empire fell in the 5th century, many of its aristocratic families had already faded. Their names lived on in marble and scroll, but their bloodlines had thinned beyond repair. The collapse was not just political, it was biological. The people who once claimed dominion over the world had slowly poisoned themselves into irrelevance. Even centuries later, when medieval scholars studied the ruins of Rome, they found remnants of these practices. Apothecary jars, bone-crushing mills, amphorae filled with the chalky remains of oyster shells. The legacy of the Roman health craze lay buried beneath layers of dust and rubble, a ghost of a civilization that tried to cheat nature and paid the price. Today, we understand the role of calcium in bone health. We know how lead disrupts the body's systems. We can measure and test, isolate and treat. But the story of Rome remains a warning that even the most powerful people, with the best intentions and the greatest resources, can be led astray by bad science and clever marketing. When we look back at Rome, we often marvel at the grandeur, the Colosseum, the roads, the literature. But we should also remember the powdered bones in golden cups, the women who swallowed chalk in the hopes of bearing healthy heirs, the men who slowly went mad while toasting their own legacy. Because that, too, is Rome, a place where myths were sold as medicine, where poison flowed like wine, and where the very effort to stay alive helped bring the empire to its knees. Chapter 3. The Great Goiter Cure That Wasn't Saltless Superstitions in the Himalayas. The wind in the high valleys of the Himalayas moves slowly, as if unsure of its own path. It threads through pine forests and icy peaks, weaving around monasteries clinging to cliffs and villages carved into mountainsides. In these remote worlds, cut off from the trade routes and empires of the lowlands, life followed a different rhythm. Time moved like the seasons, deliberate, circular, ancient, and in one such kingdom, tucked high between snowy ridges and blue rivers, time began to warp not in myth, but in minds. Long ago, there stood a small but powerful court known to its people as Kyara. Neither vast nor mighty by imperial standards, Kyara was nevertheless rich in its own right, rich in wool, in yak herds, in glacial spring water. Its people spoke a language found nowhere else. They sang of the mountains as living gods and saw the human body as a vessel for both purity and decay. This was a place ruled not just by kings, but by priests, lamas and sages whose word carried as much weight as steel swords. And in Kyara, something strange had begun to take hold. Slowly, imperceptibly, over generations. At first, it was barely noticeable. Bulging throats on children, a hesitation in the speech of young boys, a vague fogginess in the minds of teenage girls. The people of Kyara were no strangers to hardship. Mountain life was hard and cold and short, but something else was creeping in. The children were slower to speak, to read, to remember. The elders whispered about clouded spirits, and the healers prescribed fasting, chanting, and elaborate smoke rituals to clear the fog. The root of it all was deceptively simple. Salt, or rather, the lack of it. In most places, salt was a gift. In Egypt, it was sacred. In Rome, it was currency. But in Kyara, it was controversial. The priests, drawing from a complex tradition of asceticism and ritual cleanliness, began to preach that salt corrupted the spirit. It was said to overheat the blood, to disrupt the humors, to invite impurity into the body. Some believed that salt linked people too closely to the material world, tethering their souls and preventing spiritual transcendence. There was also pride involved. Salt, after all, had to be brought in from outside. It came from caravans, from merchants who spoke foreign tongues and bore unfamiliar gods. Salt was trade. Salt was dependency. And so, the leaders of Kyara, urged on by their priests, began to wean the population off it. Not all at once, just a little less with each generation. A subtle shift in diet, a slight reformation in monastery kitchens. Eventually, salt was used only in ceremonial settings, in tiny amounts, mixed with butter and barley flour for funeral rites and temple blessings. The living did not need it, they said. The body would learn to purify itself. But the body could not without iodine. Iodine is one of those substances that the human body cannot create. It must be consumed. And in high mountain regions, far from the sea and its mineral-rich bounty, iodine is naturally scarce. Salt, especially sea salt, is one of the only reliable sources of it. When it disappears from the diet, the consequences unfold slowly but terribly. The thyroid gland, desperate for iodine, begins to swell. first, it looks like a simple puffiness, then a lump, then a sack of tissue bulging from the neck like a second chin. These goiters became so common in Chiara that they were no longer even remarked upon. Children were born with them. Villagers joked about them. Local artists began depicting deities with swollen necks, believing it was a sign of divine wisdom. But iodine deficiency does more than change appearance. It rewires the brain, especially in the womb and in early childhood. Without iodine, neural development stutters. Memory, reasoning, coordination all begin to dull. The priests saw this too, but offered different explanations. The gods were testing the children, or perhaps the children were not praying hard enough. Some whispered of a curse. Some called it karma. The court of Chiara, once known for its clever scribes and insightful scholars, began to slow. Royal children, once groomed to debate poetry and statecraft, now mumbled and stared blankly at tutors. One crown prince, born during a sacred festival, could not speak a complete sentence by age 12. His mother blamed a demon. His father ordered an exorcism. Neither worked. Outside the palace, villagers struggled to remember harvest dates or perform traditional songs. Farmers forgot planting rhythms. Shepherds lost track of flocks. Whole generations began to drift through life with a veil over their minds. They were not mad. They were not sick. They were simply dulled permanently. And still, the priests refused salt. One healer, a young woman named Temza, began to notice a pattern. She had traveled further than most into lower valleys and border regions, where the people still used a pinch of rock salt in their soups. She noticed that the children there were quicker, their throats smooth, their eyes alert. She returned to Chiara with questions, carrying tiny pouches of grayish salt tied inside her cloak. When she suggested it be used in temple meals, the priests were furious. Salt, they said, was temptation. It was not native. It was unclean. Temza persisted, but quietly. She visited a small school where she began adding pinches of salt to the children's tea. Just a little, hidden under butter and barley. Months passed, then a year. The children began speaking faster, remembering poems, laughing more. A few older villagers called it a miracle, but someone told the priests, and Temza was cast out. They said she was poisoning the people, that she was an agent of outsiders, sent to defile the purity of the court. She fled into the southern foothills, where her story faded into legend. In time, she was remembered as either a saint or a witch, depending on who told the tale. Back in the palace, the rot deepened. By the time the next king took the throne, he was barely functional. Records describe him as soft-minded and childlike, though these were written decades later by lowland scribes who encountered what remained of the dynasty. Ministers ran the kingdom in his name. Taxes went uncollected. Roads crumbled. Invaders met little resistance. The fall was not dramatic. No great war, no flaming cities. Just silence. A slow fade. One day, the royal banners stopped flying. A year later, the caravans stopped coming. Eventually, Chiara disappeared from maps altogether. And when future travelers passed through the abandoned valleys, they saw only the remnants. Monasteries overgrown with moss, shrines with cracked statues, villages where goitered skulls lay half-buried in mountain soil. Centuries later, European explorers entered the Himalayan interior. Some noted the high rate of goiters among isolated populations. They took samples, made maps, and eventually iodine was identified as the missing piece. Salt was reintroduced. Health improved. But by then, the court of Chiara was long gone. Its story reduced to fragments in regional folklore. Today, iodine deficiency is one of the most easily preventable causes of intellectual disability in the world. A few grams of iodized salt can safeguard an entire village. But in Chiara, the rejection of that knowledge, born from pride, from ritual, from fear of the foreign, doomed a dynasty not with swords, but with silence. Bad science did not just steal minds. It erased a kingdom. There's something haunting in that a civilization could vanish not because of conquest, but because it believed in the wrong cure, because it refused to taste what it saw as impure, and because, in the end, it valued spiritual ideals more than the small, vital needs of the human body. We think of bad rulers as tyrants, cowards, or fools, but what if they were simply unwell? What if the kingdom that raised them failed to nourish their minds before they could even speak? That is the story of Chiara, a place where purity was prized above all, and where an entire generation of leaders grew up with fogged thoughts, swollen throats, and a strange, soft sadness in their eyes. It is a story not of sudden collapse, but of slow erosion, of a society that starved itself of truth in pursuit of perfection. A kingdom that vanished not in fire, but in forgetting. Chapter 4. The Pharaoh's Magic Elixir, Gold Water, and Vitamin Delusions in Ancient Egypt. The Nile flowed like a vein through the body of Egypt, steady, ancient, eternal. Along its banks rose temples of stone, golden tombs, and cities carved in geometry and sand. The people worshipped the sun, revered the flood, and watched their pharaoh with the awe reserved for gods. He was more than a man. He was Horus on earth, divine in breath and blood. And for a time, one such pharaoh truly believed he could ascend beyond flesh, transcend hunger, decay, and even death itself, not through war or monument, but by sipping immortality from a cup. The story begins in the golden twilight of the New Kingdom, in a time when Egypt stood mighty but quietly trembling beneath the weight of its own splendor. The pharaoh, young, brilliant, and restless, had been crowned with all the fire of Ra in his chest. He was adored by the priesthood, which found him impressionable. His youth had been steeped in rites and mystery, in whispered lore about eternal life and the healing powers of precious substances. As a boy, he had wandered through temple libraries, trailing fingers over papyri that spoke of alchemy and the transformation of the soul through purified matter. By the time he took the throne, the idea had consumed him. At first, it was a private curiosity. Gold, the flesh of the gods, was considered incorruptible. It did not tarnish. It gleamed forever, untouched by time. The priests claimed that it carried divine essence. In some rites, it was used to gild statues of Osiris or coat the tongues of the dead so they might speak in the afterlife. But the pharaoh wanted more than symbolism. He wanted to ingest the gods. And so he asked the priests for a drink. Not a metaphor, not a prayer, but a real elixir made of gold. They obliged. How could they not? To deny the pharaoh was to risk ruin. And besides, this was their opportunity. So they crafted a brew they called Shemsu per Ankh, the drink of the house of life. It was thick and sweet, made of honey, dates, crushed lotus, and, most importantly, trace particles of gold. To dissolve gold in liquid, They used a crude method involving vinegar and ground mineral salts, creating a solution that glittered faintly under torchlight. The pharaoh drank it with reverence. He believed it would preserve him, not just his body, but his divine essence, that his joints would not age, that his organs would resist rot, that his seed would be strong and his mind illuminated. At first he seemed brighter, more energetic. He declared longer festivals, sang hymns from the palace balconies, spent hours in temple courtyards absorbing the sun. He claimed he could see dreams even while awake. His court followed suit. Ministers requested samples of the drink. Nobles began to copy his rituals, brewing their own versions from pirated recipes and temple gossip. The market around the temples bloomed. Beekeepers made fortunes selling the finest honey. Goldsmiths found themselves refining metal into dust instead of jewelry. The priests, suddenly indispensable, charged for purification prayers to bless each batch. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The pharaoh had begun to eat less. "The gods," he said, "do not eat like men." He believed that food was an earthly corruption, a reminder of mortality. He replaced grain and meat with tonics, increasingly laced with gold and plant extracts. His favorites were heavy on lotus pollen, which made him dreamy, and black cumin oil, which the priests said awoke the life force. He drank infusions of myrrh and resin, and always the gold. His body began to change. His limbs grew thin despite his robes. He stood too long under the sun and swayed when he walked. Courtiers noticed that he no longer danced during festivals. His skin, once smooth, began to yellow. His gums receded. At ceremonies, he sometimes forgot lines from the sacred texts, blinking rapidly, lips trembling. But the priests dismissed it as divine ecstasy. The god was merely shedding his human shell, they said. Inside the palace, however, things were harder to hide. Palace workers complained of headaches and nausea. The cooks had been ordered to prepare increasingly strange meals for the royal family. Pastes of powdered seeds, sun-dried herbs, boiled roots soaked in honey. One child, a young prince, refused to eat and collapsed during a chariot lesson. Servants whispered about the hungry sickness. Nurses were forbidden from giving children meat or milk without priestly approval. There were no outright punishments, only a creeping fear of violating the new dietary rules. The royal children, once strong and playful, became thin, lethargic. One girl lost her hair by the age of 10. Another boy developed a tremor that made it difficult to hold a pen. The priests blamed demons, or cosmic imbalance, or disobedience. They prescribed more elixirs. Meanwhile, the priests grew rich. They published scrolls with diagrams showing the energy flow of the elixirs. They built new laboratories inside temple grounds, where select acolytes, chosen not for their scientific skill but for their loyalty, learned how to blend gold into different forms. Tinctures, powders, salves. They named them after gods. The eye of Horus tonic for vision, the breath of Thoth for memory, the milk of Hathor for fertility. Each was priced by the purity of the gold and the phase of the moon during preparation. Foreign traders paid in linen and lapis to bring samples home. A cult was forming, wrapped in the prestige of health and divinity. Outside the palace, famine struck. A year of low Nile flood left the black silt thin. Grain harvests faltered. bread grew more expensive. The peasants struggled. But inside the palace, the pharaoh's kitchens still demanded massive amounts of honey and spices, fruits and flowers. These goods were rerouted from starving provinces. Oxen that once plowed fields were slaughtered for their bones, used not for food, but for marrow extracts added to royal potions. More labor was redirected to maintain the pharaoh's health regime than to rebuild irrigation canals. Discontent smoldered. There were no rebellions, no mobs, just fatigue. Soldiers went unpaid. Scribes lost their posts. Villagers stopped sending tribute. The empire, bloated with ritual, was slowly starving. And still the pharaoh drank. He believed, now more than ever, that his transformation was nearly complete. His bones ached, but the priests said it was the gold purging impurities. His skin flaked, but they claimed he was molting like a sacred bird. He was carried now during public processions, too weak to walk, but he smiled broadly through pain. One morning, during the festival of Opet, he collapsed while attempting to raise the crook and flail. The crowd gasped. The priests quickly formed a circle, chanting protection spells as he was rushed inside. He never fully recovered. From that day forward, the pharaoh appeared only in silhouette behind veils, behind columns. His proclamations were read aloud by priests. His orders were increasingly abstract, contradictory. He asked for statues of himself with wings. He commissioned murals showing his transformation into light. It was not death he feared. It was decay, weakness, memory. He died quietly in a perfumed chamber, surrounded by bowls of gold-infused honey and lotus wine. His heart failed. His body, already weakened by months, perhaps years of malnutrition and metal toxicity, could no longer function. The priests embalmed him with extraordinary care, filling his body with the very substances that killed him. His tomb was a masterpiece, and for a brief time the people wept. But the truth could not be buried. His children died young. The dynasty weakened. Power shifted to a new line, less consumed with bodily divinity and more interested in stabilizing the realm. The temples that once brewed elixirs were shuttered or repurposed. Some priests were exiled. Others faded into obscurity. And yet, the allure of gold water never quite died. Centuries later, in Greek and Roman texts, stories still appeared of Egyptian potions that could restore youth or prolong life. Alchemists chased the recipe through generations. Even in modern times, fragments of this ancient obsession persist. In tales of monoatomic gold, in homeopathic tinctures, in wellness circles that repeat the promise of vitality drawn from metal. But Egypt knew first, and Egypt paid the price. They saw firsthand how the thirst for perfect health, untethered from reason, could hollow out an empire from within. The pharaoh's belief in immortality, wrapped in ceremony and sold as wisdom, had starved his children, drained his treasury, and sickened a palace. This is not the story of a single madman. It is the story of belief gone unchecked, of rituals turned into revenue, of a civilization so advanced it convinced itself that magic could replace medicine. And in the end, as the Nile rolled on and sand gathered around shattered tombs, the gods remained silent, and the drink of eternal life was forgotten. Just another faded myth, glittering faintly in the dark. Chapter 5. Chinese Emperors and the Ginseng Empire, a root of trouble. High in the misty hills of Manchuria, where the forests breathe ancient secrets and the moss grows thick upon stone. There once sprouted a root so revered it could shake the fate of emperors. Ginseng. The name alone carried the weight of healing, wisdom, and immortality. For thousands of years in imperial China, ginseng was no mere herb. It was a symbol, a promise, and eventually a curse. This is the story of how a single root, worshipped beyond reason, fed a royal delusion, drained a nation, and almost brought an empire to its knees. It began with belief. In the earliest dynasties, Taoist physicians wrote of ginseng as the essence of the earth, a gift from the mountains, said to restore qi, the vital energy that animated life itself. Shaped like a human body, the root was thought to mirror mankind and thus mend it. Tired lungs, failing hearts, clouded minds, all were said to yield to ginseng's power. In small amounts, carefully prepared, it could indeed aid the sick. But the real trouble began when emperors began demanding more than health. They wanted immortality. The fascination reached fever pitch during the Ming and Qing dynasties. Scholars, alchemists, and physicians competed to find ever more potent varieties. The red ginseng from Korea was said to be the strongest, so rare that a single root could cost more than a year's salary. Imperial physicians began creating elaborate tonics made almost entirely of ginseng, mixed with deer antler, pearl dust, and gold flakes. Some emperors sipped these brews daily. Others banned any non-ginseng-based treatments from the palace, convinced that only the root could maintain their divine mandate. The most infamous case was Emperor Yongzheng of the Qing dynasty. A hard-working ruler obsessed with administrative reform, he was also privately obsessed with longevity. He ordered shipments of wild ginseng to be delivered weekly to the Forbidden City. His court records show prescriptions for ginseng tea, ginseng wine, ginseng poultices, and even ginseng incense. As his obsession deepened, he ate less food and more root, believing it refined his energy. His health began to wane, but his physicians dared not challenge the regimen. Outside the palace walls, the effects were devastating. Imperial demand created a booming market. Peasant farmers were pressured to abandon rice and millet to search for or cultivate ginseng. Whole villages in the northeast were converted into harvesting stations. The government passed laws restricting ginseng trade to licensed officials, but corruption quickly took root. Local governors skimmed profits. Soldiers escorted ginseng caravans instead of guarding borders. Meanwhile, a black market flourished. Counterfeiters seized the opportunity. In back alleys and mountain huts, roots were carved to resemble ginseng. White radish, wild parsnip, even shaped with soaked in tea were passed off as the real thing. Some were harmless. Others were laced with opiates or mercury to mimic ginseng's stimulating effects. The court was flooded with fakes, but the emperor, convinced of ginseng's divinity, refused to believe his tonic could be tainted. To meet the palace's growing appetite, regional governors began demanding ever larger ginseng quotas. Crops once grown to feed entire provinces were uprooted in favor of the prized root. Forests were stripped bare. Hillsides once thick with pine were gouged into terraces for cultivation. The ecological balance, finely tuned for centuries, began to tilt. Rivers silted. Game vanished. Pests moved in. And then the rains failed. For 2 years in the late 18th century, the monsoon pattern shifted. Drought struck the heartlands. The rice paddies cracked. Wells ran dry. With so much land devoted to ginseng, there were few grain reserves. The government, bloated and distracted by tonic schemes, was slow to respond. Peasants begged for food relief, but much of the imperial granary was already sold to fund ginseng procurement. In some provinces, starvation arrived like a wave. Villages lost half their population. Stories emerged of parents trading children for sacks of millet. In one grim account, a tax caravan was found abandoned, its guards having eaten the paper seals from their ration boxes. Yet, in the Forbidden City, the emperor continued to receive his gilded vials of root extract. The famine triggered revolt. In the southwest, rebels known as the White Lotus rose up, their banners marked with cries against root tyranny. They blamed the emperor's obsession for their suffering. Though the rebellion had many causes, taxation, corruption, land loss, the symbolism of ginseng became a rallying cry. To them, it was the physical embodiment of imperial decadence. Even among the scholar officials, dissent grew. Some tried to reintroduce classical medicine based on food therapy and balance. But the palace remained a closed circuit. The emperor's inner circle had too much to lose. Priests and alchemists swore that the ginseng was working. Any signs of illness were blamed on cosmic imbalance or spiritual impurity. Yongzheng died at 57, a respectable age, but far from the immortal life he'd sought. His son, Qianlong, inherited not only the throne but the mess. He tried to moderate the court's dependency on tonics. He funded rice distribution and punished a few counterfeiters. But the damage had been done. The countryside was hollowed out. Trust in medicine fractured. Superstition had been institutionalized. Even centuries later, the legacy lingered. Chinese medicine remained revered, but its misuse during the ginseng era created lasting skepticism. Some historians argue that the empire's weakened resilience during later colonial pressure stemmed in part from decades of misguided health policies and agricultural distortion. Modern science would later reveal that while ginseng can offer mild benefits, especially in stress response and fatigue, it is no miracle, cannot extend life, cannot cure disease, and in excess, it can strain the liver, raise blood pressure, and interfere with digestion. The emperor had swallowed not just a root, but a myth, and yet the story is not unique. It echoes across cultures. The search for a single cure, the magical thinking that exalts one substance above all others. But rarely had such belief reached the heights of empire or caused such widespread hunger. The Ginseng Empire was not built on lies alone. It was built on the desire for power without cost, for life without limits. But nature has no shortcuts, and for all its supposed wisdom, the empire forgot that roots grow slowly, and they feed best when left in balance with the soil from which they came. In chasing immortality, they sowed collapse. In choosing root over rice, they invited hunger. And in placing myth above medicine, they nearly lost the very mandate of heaven they so desperately clung to. Chapter 6. The Aztec Cocoa Cure, When Superfoods Turned Deadly. In the heart of the Valley of Mexico, long before Spanish sails pierced the horizon, the mighty Aztec Empire flourished with temples that kissed the sky, markets that pulsed with life, and a culture as rich as the volcanic soil beneath their feet. Among the treasures of this golden age stood one object above all: the cacao bean. Revered as a gift from Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of wisdom, Cacao was more than a crop. It was currency, sacrament, and sustenance. But in the centuries before the fall, the sacred bean was transformed into something more dangerous. In their zeal to draw health and power from it, the Aztecs elevated cacao into a divine cure-all. And in doing so, they sowed the seeds of their own vulnerability. It began innocently with ritual. In the great temples of Tenochtitlan, priests prepared cacao drinks in solemn ceremony, mixed with chili, maize, and sometimes the ashes of sacrificed warriors. The bitter brew was said to grant visions, strength, and clarity of mind. Warriors drank it before battle. Nobles took it to sharpen their senses. The emperor himself was said to consume dozens of cups a day. The brew, known as zacatl, was not sweet, but sacred. It burned the throat and stirred the spirit. Over time, cacao became more than a ritual stimulant. Aztec healers and priest-physicians began prescribing it for every ailment. Stomach cramps, fevers, melancholy, even plague. All could be treated, they claimed, with the proper preparation of the bean. For stomach pain, one might mix cacao with bark and lime. For fevers, with maize and rabbit blood. For spiritual cleansing, it was taken with obsidian ground ash and chili so hot it could strip the lining from the tongue. As belief deepened, alternatives faded. Traditional herbs used by older generations, like epazote, yarrow, or chaya, were pushed aside. The priesthood, eager to reinforce their control over both health and faith, promoted cacao as the only truly divine medicine. They taught that its bitterness mirrored the bitterness of human struggle, and thus, by embracing it, one aligned with the cosmic balance. Dissenting voices were quieted, or labeled as spiritually impure. Then came the sickness. It is difficult to say what exactly struck the Aztec Empire in the decades before Spanish contact. Some believe it was smallpox carried north from earlier European expeditions. Others suspect homegrown epidemics, possibly hemorrhagic fevers or typhus. What is certain is this: entire villages began to empty. People bled from the nose, burned with fever, and collapsed in the streets. The sickness moved quickly, unrelenting, and utterly foreign. Faced with terror, the priest-physicians doubled down. They claimed the gods were angry, and cacao, sacred, bitter, and strong, was the only way to restore favor. They created new formulations, mixing cacao with bone ash, obsidian dust, and even human blood taken from ritual sacrifices. The elite consumed it daily, locking themselves in temples and palaces, believing the bitter brew would keep the sickness away. The common people followed as best they could, bartering away grain and livestock for a handful of the precious beans. But cacao was no cure. The sickness swept through cities and countryside alike. The rich died in their feathered robes. The poor perished in clay huts. Entire households vanished. The priesthood responded not with medicine, but with spectacle. More sacrifices, more rituals, more cacao. They burned herbs and incense, flooded the altars with blood, and drank their bitter brew with ever more desperation. What they failed to understand was that their devotion had become a blinder. In their insistence that cacao could cure all ills, they ignored other signs. They failed to isolate the sick. They gathered in great crowds for healing ceremonies, inadvertently spreading the illness. They rejected calls from herbalists and midwives to return to old remedies, accusing them of heresy. And as the body count grew, the faith only hardened. There are records from early Nahua codices, later preserved under Spanish oversight, that describe entire regions refusing food aid if it did not contain cacao. Some communities wasted their last reserves brewing tonics for the dying, while neglecting the living. Others buried their dead with cacao beans in their mouths, believing it would ensure safe passage through the underworld. The logic was circular. If someone recovered, cacao was credited. If they died, it was because they lacked enough. It was into this weakened, frightened world that the Spaniards arrived. Hernán Cortés and his men marveled at the golden city of Tenochtitlan, but they also found a people shaken. Disease had already taken its toll. Some suggest that up to a third of the empire's population had been lost before the first musket was fired. The defenders were still brave, still proud, but their strength was fractured. Cortés himself noted the prominence of cacao. He recorded how the Emperor Montezuma consumed it constantly, often before court audiences and diplomatic discussions. The Spaniards initially dismissed the bitter brew as foul, but they quickly recognized its value. Cacao became one of the first major exports from the New World. Ironically, while it would become a sweet luxury in Europe, it had been a deadly obsession in the land of its birth. The final insult came in the form of faith. As Spanish missionaries moved through the land, they reinterpreted cacao in Christian terms. They condemned its use in native ritual, branding it pagan and dangerous. Yet within decades, they themselves adopted it as a clerical beverage, served during long fasts and ceremonies. The same drink that once symbolized Aztec divinity was absorbed into the colonial church. Stripped of its meaning, cacao was rebranded. But the damage was done. Historians now argue that the Aztec Empire's over-reliance on cacao as a medical panacea helped accelerate its collapse. The cacao cure, far from healing, had blinded. It had diverted resources, undermined real treatments, and fed a system of magical thinking at the worst possible moment. It is a tragic irony that a food so powerful, so central to life and culture, became a tool of death when misused. Modern science does lend cacao some credibility. Raw cacao contains flavonoids that support cardiovascular health. It has mild stimulant effects, can elevate mood, but it is not a cure. It is not immune to disease, and it is certainly not a replacement for sound medicine. The Aztecs, for all their wisdom and complexity, fell prey to the same error that haunts many societies, the belief that one sacred thing can solve every problem. The story of the Aztec cocoa cure is not just about food, or empire, or faith. It is about how even the most revered traditions can turn against us when wielded without skepticism. It is about how power can distort truth, and how in moments of crisis, the line between salvation and superstition can grow perilously thin. And it is a reminder that even today, in a world of superfoods and miracle supplements, we are not so different from those priests on the temple steps, clutching their cacao bowls, eyes wide with hope, blind to the reality that surrounded them. Chapter 7. The Vitamin Revolution That Never Was. Early 20th Century Pellagra and the Southern U.S. Collapse. In the early years of the 20th century, the American South looked like a land stuck between centuries. Railroads stitched together tired towns. Cotton fields stretched endlessly under a hot sun. And in homes from Alabama to Mississippi, dinner looked remarkably the same. Cornbread, molasses, and maybe fatback if times were good. These were humble meals, a patchwork of survival. But they held a terrible secret. Beneath the illusion of normalcy, a silent plague was spreading. It started with skin. People in rural towns began to develop strange rashes. The backs of hands, the neck, the face. The skin turned red, then darkened, then cracked open like bark. Next came the stomach. Victims lost their appetite. Diarrhea followed. And then came the mind. Confusion, memory loss, hallucinations. Families watched as loved ones lost their grip on reality. Neighbors whispered about curses. Doctors called it madness. But the condition had a name. Pellagra. No one understood what caused it. At first, people believed it was an infectious disease. Perhaps something in the water. Perhaps filth or bad air. Local officials tried to clean up the towns, but pellagra only worsened. Then they blamed lifestyle. Victims were poor, yes. Many were black. Many were tenant farmers. So the authorities blamed laziness, blamed ignorance, blamed moral failings. But none of it explained why entire asylums began to overflow. None of it explained why mothers wasted away while their children watched. Doctors in the north began to take notice. Pellagra was rare outside the south. Something about the region seemed to be feeding the illness. Investigators were sent. They visited plantations and mills. They noted the diet. Cornmeal, lard, and molasses, eaten day after day. Vegetables were rare, meat even rarer. In towns gutted by poverty and racism, corn was life. But it was also death. At the time, the very idea of vitamins was new. Scientists had only just begun to suspect that there were essential substances in food, invisible but vital. In Europe, similar diseases had been traced to diet. Beriberi, scurvy, they had been solved by recognizing vitamin deficiencies. But in the American South, that idea was controversial. To accept that pellagra was caused by food meant accepting that poverty, not moral failure, was the culprit. It meant the state, the system, the economy, all had blood on their hands. Enter Dr. Joseph Goldberger. A government physician, Goldberger was assigned to study pellagra in 1914. He traveled through Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. He saw the bloated asylums, the wasted children. He studied the victims' meals and compared them to healthier populations. And slowly he became convinced pellagra was not a germ. It was not sin. It was a deficiency. Something essential was missing from the Southern diet. Goldberger did something radical. He tested his theory not with microscopes but with food. He fed institutionalized patients diets rich in milk, meat, and vegetables. Pellagra vanished. Then he removed those foods and the symptoms returned. Still, skeptics mocked him. Critics accused him of fabricating results. Southern leaders balked. Admitting that their economic model was starving people was too much. They preferred the disease to the truth. Goldberger even went so far as to test on himself. In one infamous experiment, he and his assistants ingested skin flakes, feces, and blood from pellagra patients. They rubbed infected material into their noses and mouths. But they never developed the disease. It wasn't contagious, he proved. Yet the resistance only hardened. In the vacuum of leadership, charlatans rushed in. Snake oil salesmen promised miracle cures. Tonics made of alcohol, herbs, and colored water flooded the market. Some claimed to boost vitality. Others sold vitamin elixirs with no vitamins at all. Poor families, desperate and frightened, paid for these frauds with what little money they had. Pharmacies stocked shelves with worthless cures, while children died in their beds. Meanwhile, the South's economy continued to crack. Pellagra wasn't just a health crisis. It sapped the labor force. It drained families. Workers at cotton mills collapsed. Farmhands disappeared. Small towns shrank. Schools closed. Entire communities became ghost towns. The disease created a feedback loop of poverty and decline. By the 1920s, millions were affected. Goldberger never lived to see full vindication. He died in 1929, still facing ridicule. But a few years later, his hypothesis was proven correct. Scientists identified the missing nutrient, niacin, or vitamin B3. Corn, the staple of the Southern diet, lacked bioavailable niacin unless treated with an alkaline process, a method used by indigenous Mesoamerican cultures but abandoned by European settlers. Without niacin, the body fell apart. And in the South, almost no one was getting enough. The federal government began enriching foods. Campaigns spread awareness. Slowly, the rates of pellagra declined. But the scars were permanent. Thousands had died. Tens of thousands more had suffered brain damage, disability, and social ruin. Generations were affected. The South entered the Great Depression already weakened by years of nutritional collapse. And the worst part? Could have been prevented. The knowledge was there if people had listened. The cure was not exotic, not expensive. Just a change in diet. Just a shift in belief. But pride, prejudice, and profiteering stood in the way. The South's refusal to face the truth turned a manageable deficiency into a humanitarian disaster. In hindsight, the story of pellagra reads like a cautionary tale. But it is also disturbingly modern. Even today, false cures flourish. Vitamin scams, miracle supplements, and fad diets promise everything and deliver little. Entire industries profit from nutritional fear. The same mistakes play out again and again, dressed in new packaging, sold with slicker branding. The story of the vitamin revolution that never was is a reminder that even in an age of science, denial can kill. That when systems prioritize ideology over evidence, people suffer. And that the simplest solutions, a varied diet, honest medicine, and public accountability, are often the hardest to sell. In dusty southern towns where pellagra once reigned, you can still find remnants. Old clinics, abandoned farms, cemeteries with headstones bearing the same year. They stand as monuments to the cost of ignoring truth. And they echo a warning that rings far beyond the red clay fields where the skin first began to crack.